Audible is the leading provider of spoken word entertainment and audiobooks, ranging from bestsellers to celebrity memoirs, news, business, and self-development. Every month, members get 1 credit to pick any title, plus 2 Audible originals from a monthly selection, and access to daily news digests from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, as well as guided meditation programs. Between a full-time job in IT and a full-time job in podcasting, it gets harder and harder to sit down and read the books I'm interested in. This is where Audible comes in. I can listen on my daily commute, relaxing, or while out running errands and still get in the books I've been wanting to get into. You can download titles and listen offline anytime, anywhere. The app is free and can be installed on all smartphones and tablets. Now you can try Audible risk-free with a special 30-day free trial by visiting audibletrial.com/Nerdery and Murdery. That's audibletrial.com/Nerdery and Murdery. Don't let your busy life get in the way of that great book you've been wanting to read. Go get your free trial of Audible today. This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. This is Geoffrey, and we've talked about many times before that I experience problems and struggles with my mental health, and really without a healthy mind, being truly happy and at peace is hard. The good news is therapy does work. It's helped for me, but what is therapy exactly? It's whatever you want it to be. Maybe you're not feeling motivated right now and would like some tools to help. Or maybe you're feeling insecure in relationships at work, or you're not dealing well with stress. Whatever you need, it's really time to stop being ashamed of normal human struggles, and it's time to start feeling better because you deserve to be happy. And now you don't have to worry about finding an in-person therapist near you to help. BetterHelp is a customized online therapy that offers video, phone, and even live chat sessions with your therapist, so you don't have to see anyone on camera if you don't want to. It's much more affordable than in-person therapy, and you can start communicating with your therapist in under 48 hours. So join the millions of people who are seeing what online therapy is really about. It's always a good time to invest in yourself because you are your greatest asset. And there's a special offer to Nerdery and Murdery listeners. You can get 10% off your first month of professional therapy at betterhelp.com/Nerdery and Murdery. That's betterhelp.com/Nerdery and Murdery. Thanks again to BetterHelp for sponsoring this podcast.
Dun 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 dun.
Nice. Welcome to episode 109 of Nerdery and Murdery.
109, I'm Zig with your nerdery.
I'm Geoffrey with your Murdery, and forgive me, I'm feeling a little under the weather, so trying to make it through this episode. So Zig, I'll let you take over on the nerdery side of the house.
Well, thank you, sir, and sorry for that, Broham. Today, we're going to talk about the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the NES.
Cool.
The NES, or Nintendo Entertainment System, is an 8-bit third-generation home video game console produced by Nintendo. It was first released in Japan in 1983 as the Family Computer, or commonly referred to as the Famicom. The NES redesigned version was released in American test markets on October 18, 1985, before becoming widely available in North America and other countries. I kind of want to talk about the history of where they got the idea for the NES, some of the interesting things that happened, before it was released first. So after developing a series of successful arcade games in the early 1980s, Nintendo planned to create a home video game console. Rejecting more complex proposals, the Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi, called for a simple, cheap console that ran games stored on cartridges. The controller design was reused from Nintendo's portable Game Watch games, and Nintendo released several add-ons such as a light gun for shooting games. The NES was one of the best-selling consoles of its time and helped to revitalize the U.S. gaming industry following the video game crash of 1983. It introduced a now standard business model of licensing third-party developers to produce and distribute games. The NES featured a number of groundbreaking games, such as the 1985 platform game Super Mario Bros. And the 1986 action-adventure game The Legend of Zelda and Metroid, which became long-running franchises. It was succeeded in 1990 by the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. In 2011, IGN named the NES the greatest video game console of all time. Now, the video game industry was experiencing a period of rapid growth and unprecedented popularity during the late 70s into the early 80s, with what they called the golden age of arcade video games and the second generation of video game consoles. You had Space Invaders and its shoot 'em up clones had become a phenomenal success across arcades all over the world. Game consoles such as the Atari 2600 and the Intellivision became popular in North American homes, and the Epoch Cassette Vision became the best-selling console in Japan. Many companies arose in their wake to exploit the growing industry. One such company was Nintendo. The basis for the Famicom hardware was arcade video game hardware. A major influence was Namco's Galaxian, which had replaced the more intensive bitmap rendering system of Space Invaders with a hardware sprite rendering system that animated sprites over a scrolling background, allowing more detailed graphics, faster gameplay, and scrolling animation, scrolling animated starfield backgrounds. This provided the basis for Nintendo's Radar Scope arcade hardware, which they co-developed with Ikegami Tsushiniki, improving on Galaxian with technologies such as high-speed emitter-coupled logic, or ECL, integrated circuits, IC, chips, and memory, and a 15 megahertz printed circuit board. Following the commercial failure of Radar Scope, the game's arcade hardware was converted to use with Donkey Kong, which became a major arcade hit. Home systems at the time were not powerful enough to handle an accurate portrait of Donkey Kong to be played in homes. Led by Masayuki Uemura, I'm so sorry, I am butchering these poor Japanese men's names today. Nintendo's Nintendo's R&D2 team began to work on a home system in 1982. Ambitiously targeted to be less expensive than its competitors, yet with performance that could not be surpassed by same said competitors. For at least a year, the console began development under the codename Project GameCon. Uemura analyzed the innards of rival consoles, including the Atari 2600 and the Magnavox Odyssey. Sidestepping their primitive technology, their main competition was the Epoch Cassette Vision. They say cassette, but in Japan, the word for cassette and cartridge are basically the same thing. So it's not actually a cassette, it's actually a cartridge, which was the best-selling console in Japan at the time. With Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi telling the employees he wanted them to develop a console both more powerful and cheaper than the cassette Vision. Nintendo R&D2 engineer Katsura Nakagawa analyzed the IC chips and the more powerful Donkey Kong arcade hardware, concluding that it would be possible to use them as a basis for their console. Another Nintendo R&D2 engineer, Tako Sawano, proposed that the D-pad of Nintendo's Game Watch handheld devices should be adapted for the console. Mostly because it was just really easy to use. Because, they released that, well, they call it a Game Watch. It was a little fold open screen display. And it told time, but you could also play a game on it. It had that gamepad on it. A lot like what they came out with in the early 2000s with the DS. The Game Watch looked a lot like that. It was just much more primitive. They didn't actually start putting that stuff in watches until a few years later. But in North America, the toy manufacturer Coleco was working on a new home console to compete with the Atari 2600, and which would be capable of handling fairly accurate ports of arcade games. Coleco demonstrated a prototype of the ColecoVision to two Nintendo R&D2 engineers, who were unimpressed by the smoothly animated graphics. It left a strong impression on Solano and Uemura, that's it, who had the ColecoVision in mind while working on Nintendo's new console in Japan. However, while the ColecoVision was a significant improvement over the Atari 2600, there was still no console comparable to the original Donkey Kong arcade hardware. Nevertheless, the bundle's port of Donkey Kong helped the ColecoVision become a major success in North America. Now, what's funny is Coleco got the rights to produce console versions in North America for all consoles. And so instead of just making the one for the ColecoVision, they also made one for the Atari 2600 and the Intellivision. The thing was, when they made those ports, they made them intentionally worse than the port that they had.
Mm-hmm.
So ColecoVision's port of Donkey Kong was better than everybody else's, and yet they were still making money off of everyone else's. So it was really smart. Uemura sent the engineer Katsuo Nakakawa and Mashiro Otake to meet with Raiko, a semiconductor manufacturer that had previously worked with Nintendo on arcade games. One of Raiko's supervisors was Hiramatsu Yagi, a former Mitsubishi electronics engineer who had previously designed the large-scale integration chips for the Nintendo Color TV game consoles of the 1970s. Basically, Nintendo had a deal with Atari in the 70s to make Pong consoles. To determine the system specifications of the new console, Nakakawa and Mashiro brought along a Donkey Kong arcade machine for Rico to analyze. In order to help build a console more powerful than any other consoles at the time, and which would be comparable to the Donkey Kong arcade hardware. Uemura initially thought by using modern 16-bit central processing units, but instead he settled on an 8-bit CPU based on inexpensive MOS technology, the 6502. Supplementing it with a custom graphics chip, the picture processing unit, the PPU is what they called it, which Raiko produced. To reduce costs, suggestions of including a keyboard, modem, and floppy disk drive were rejected. But expensive circuitry was added to provide a versatile 15-pin expansion port connection on the front of the console for future add-ons on functionality such as peripheral devices. The keyboard, Famicom modem, and Famicom disk system would later be released as add-on peripherals, all utilizing the Famicom expansion port. Other peripheral devices connected via the expansion port would include the Famicom Light Gun, Family Trainer, and various specialized controllers. Many would be released in Japan only, such as the Famicom 3D system and Famicom disk system. So when they say disk system, what they mean is a floppy drive. Nintendo produced its own floppy drive for the Famicom. If you get an adapter, you can take one of those disk drives and run it on an NES. It will run over here. It's all in Japanese. But the disk system games that they produced in Japan for the Famicom were basically what our cartridge games were over here. So like the first time you got Super Mario Brothers, it was on a disc in Japan a couple of years before it came out here on a cartridge. They just figured out how to beef up the system when they released it over here. So Famicom released in Japan in 1983 to 1984. Nintendo had its own exhibition to unveil the Famicom, becoming a sensation among toy show exhibitors. Shortly afterwards, the competing Sega SG-1000 was unveiled at the Tokyo Toy Show. The Sega 1000 and the Famicom were unveiled at the same toy show, like one day apart. Like one unveiled it on a Friday and the other one unveiled theirs on a Saturday. They launched it on July 15th, 1983. The family computer, or Famicom, was released in Japan for 14,800 yen, which was about $150 at the time, which in 2021 dollars would be the equivalent of about $400. The launch game to its Donkey Kong Jr. and Popeye, the console itself was intentionally designed to look like a toy, with a bright red and white color scheme and two hand-wired gamepads that are stored visibly on the sides of the unit. I haven't included some pictures of the Famicom and the disk system on our website, just so you can get a look at it. If you've never seen a Famicom, it doesn't look like an NES. It looks like something different. But it is basically the guts of an NES. They just kind of hyped it up when they brought it over here. It sold really well. 500,000 units in its first 2 months. So, 500,000 Famicoms. However, many Famicom units repeatedly had faulty graphics chips and froze during gameplay. After tracing the problem to a faulty circuit, Nintendo voluntarily recalled all Famicom systems, 500,000 by the way, just before the holiday shopping season, and temporarily suspended production of the system while the concerns were addressed, costing Nintendo a few $1,000,000. The Famicom was subsequently reissued with a new motherboard, and the Famicom easily outsold its primary competitor, the Sega SG-1000. And by the end of 1984, Nintendo had sold more than 2.5 million Famicoms to the Japanese market. So they were off and running. It was the best-selling console in Japan, surpassing that cassette vision. Sales exceeded Nintendo's expectations, leading to the Famicom being sold out. So Nintendo raised projections and increased production in the following year. Nintendo had planned to be the exclusive provider of Famicom games during its launch year. Major arcade developer Namco approached Nintendo about Famicom development, as they had no means of cartridge production. They contracted a 30% fee for Nintendo per game sold, consisting of 10% as a licensing fee for the console and 20% as the production cost for new cartridges. By 1984, third-party Famicom games were published. The 30% fee became the de facto standard of console and storefront licensing for video game publishing throughout the 2010s. So basically, Namco was like, hey, we want to port these games over, but we don't have the ability to produce cartridges. And Nintendo says, tell you what, you pay us a 30% fee, we'll produce the cartridges for you. So everybody was happy at the time. They got unhappy later on because Nintendo told these same companies later on when they came to North America that if you make games for us, you can't make games for anybody else. There was these big legal battles that ensued, and it was just insane. But at the time, for Namco, that was a great deal. They didn't want to make a cartridge for the cassette vision because they couldn't make cartridges.
Right.
Bolstered by its success in Japan, Nintendo soon turns its attention to foreign markets. A new console manufacturer, Nintendo had to convince a skeptical public to embrace its system. To this end, Nintendo entered into negotiations with Atari to release the Famicom outside of Japan as a Nintendo Enhanced Video System, so the NEVS, with plans to release the system by the end of 1983. Though the two companies reached a tentative agreement, with final contract papers to be signed at the 1983 Summer Consumer Electronics Show, Atari refused to sign at the last minute after seeing Coleco, one of its main competitors in the market at the time, demonstrating a prototype of Donkey Kong for its forthcoming Coleco Atom home computer system. Coleco had licensed Donkey Kong for the ColecoVision, the console, but Atari had the exclusive computer licenses for the game. So if you wanted to play Donkey Kong on a computer, it was supposed to be produced by Atari. ColecoVision, because the Atom was an add-on to the ColecoVision itself, also produced a cartridge for the Atom. This pissed Jack Tramiel off because he was running Atari at the time. So they ripped the contract up. So Atari could have produced the Nintendo Entertainment System over here. So the issue was cleared up within a month or so, but Atari's financial problems stemmed from the North American video game crash in 1983, coupled with the departure of Atari CEO Ray Kazar, left the company unable to follow through with the deal in time to make the target launch. So Nintendo decided to go it alone. And honestly, after that, the head of Nintendo was basically done with Atari anyway. Even if Atari could have got their crap together, um, he was prepared to launch it himself. According to some interviews, not with him because I don't think he's around anymore, but with some people who worked for him. As soon as Atari threw that fit, he was done. He's like, we'll just do it ourselves. We don't have any problem manufacturing over here. We'll just manufacture it over there, and I bet we'll sell 3 million consoles over 4 or 5 years. He was right with everything except the number. He sold multi-millions of consoles. Nintendo Entertainment System is one of the best-selling consoles of all time. The Famicom hardware first made its North American debut in the arcades in the form of the Nintendo Versus system. Do you remember these?
Vaguely.
Yeah, and the system's success in arcades paved the way for the official release of the NES console. After the video game crash of 1983, many American retailers considered video games a passing fad and greatly reduced or discontinued the inventory of such products. A la Kmart. Yeah, by 1984, Kmart didn't sell anything like this. They didn't start selling it again until Nintendo took off.
Mm-hmm.
Market research was met with warnings to stay away from the home consoles, with U.S. retailers refusing to stock game consoles. Meanwhile, the arcade industry also had a slump, and the golden age of arcade video games came to an end. But arcades were able to recover and stabilize with the help of software conversion kit systems. Hiroshi Yamauchi realized there was still a market for video games in North America, where games were gradually returning to arcades in significant numbers. Yamauchi, I am so sorry, still had faith that there was a market for the Famicom, so he decided to introduce it to North America through the arcade industry. So what was great about these Versus machines was not only could they test out the hardware, they could test out the games. So if people came in and played a bunch of the games on the Versus system, they knew they could release them as cartridges. Punch-Out, the original Mario Brothers, Donkey Kong 3, Versus Tennis, Versus Baseball, Duck Hunt, and Versus Hogan's Alley. Now, all of them eventually made it onto the consoles, but like Versus Tennis and Versus Baseball, they weren't that, because they were keeping records of how many people played and what games they played.
Mm-hmm.
So eventually they released them, but they had accurate numbers on what people like to play in the arcades. So that's what they released first on the console. It was a really smart idea. I'm surprised more people didn't do it, but then again, arcades were kind of dying at the time. The Versus system went on to become the highest grossing arcade machine of 1985 in the United States. I did not know that. The success of the Versus system gave Nintendo the confidence to release the Famicom in North America as a video game console, which they would later call the Nintendo Entertainment System. Before releasing the NES, players were being amazed at the accuracy of the arcade ports for the NES, despite most Versus Systems game originating on the Famicom. So the thing is, people were shocked that the Nintendo Entertainment System played these games just like that arcade Versus machine. But that was the whole point. They put the Versus machines was basically a Nintendo board with a bunch of different cartridges plugged into it. Of course, they were a different format because they were in an arcade machine. But yeah, so they wanted it to be as accurate to those Versus machines as they could get it, so they just used the same hardware. Yamauchi said in 1986, Atari collapsed because they gave too much freedom to third-party developers and the market was swamped with rubbish games. After the deal with Atari failed, Nintendo proceeded alone, reconceiving the Famicom console with a sophisticated design language as the Nintendo Advanced Video System. To keep the software market from its console from becoming similarly oversaturated, Nintendo added a lockout system to obstruct unlicensed software from running on the console, thus allowing Nintendo to enforce strict licensing standards. The software carried the Nintendo seal of quality to communicate the company's approval. And it took a couple of years to bust that lockout chip. Eventually, third parties figured it out, how to bust that lockout chip, but it took them 3 or 4 years. I mean, like, the Nintendo was old school when they finally started releasing some of those games. Nintendo's product designer, Lance Barr, who would continue with the company for decades, retooled the Famicom console with a sleek and sophisticated design language. The toy-like white and red color scheme of the Famicom was replaced with a clean and futuristic color scheme of gray, black, and red. The top and the bottom portions are in different shades of gray, plus a stripe of black and ribbon along the top and minor red accents. The shape is boxier, flat on top, and a bottom half that tapered down to smaller footprint in front of the main unit features are compartments for storing the wireless controllers out of sight to avoid the stigma of video game consoles. Nintendo issued pre-release marketing as the AVS as a full home computer. The reason this doesn't sound familiar to you is because they scrapped that idea.
Right.
Included a keyboard, cassette data recorder, basic interpreter software cartridge, and the basic interpreter would later be sold together with a keyboard as the family basic package. And the cassette deck for data storage would later be released as the Famicom data recorder. So they didn't ever release any of that stuff in North America. They released it all in Japan. Because they went into the Consumer Electronics show, and they were like, the AVS just didn't, it hit it with a bunch of engineers and designers that thought it was a great idea. But when they actually test marketed it with the kids, they didn't like it. They weren't interested. They wanted to play the games. So they took it back and they retooled it. They made it a little bit more boxier. They made all the colors basically the same, and kept that angled bottom design with the flat top on top and a hinged lid and a cartridge that slid in and pushed down, or what is commonly referred to or affectionately referred to as a toaster, because it makes the same sound when you engage the cartridge. So they hurriedly rushed the NES into production, and they wanted to make it more toy-like. So at the June 1985 summer CES, Nintendo returned with a stripped-down and cost-reduced redesign of the AVS, having abandoned the home computer approach. Nintendo purposely designed the system so as not to resemble a video game console and would avoid terms associated with game console, with marketing manager Gail Tennant choosing the term Game Pack for cartridges, Control Deck for the console, and Entertainment System for the whole platform altogether. Renamed the Nintendo Entertainment System, the new and cost-reduced version lacked most of the upscale features added on the AVS, but retained many of its audiophile-inspired design elements, such as the gray color scheme and the boxy form factor. Disappointed with the cosmetic raw prototype part they received from Japan with the nickname the Lunchbox, Nintendo of America designer Lance Barr and Don James added the two-tone gray and the black stripe and the red lettering to obscure the video game connotation. NES replaced the top-loading cartridge slot of the Famicom and AVS with the front-loading chamber for software cartridges, again, the toaster model. Using another approach to marketing the system in North America, retailers as an entertainment system as opposed to a video game console, Nintendo positioned the NES more squarely as a toy, emphasizing the Zapper light gun, and more significantly, the ROB, the R-O-B, the Robotic Operating Buddy, a wireless toy robot that responded to special screen flashes with mechanized action. Although Rob successfully drew a stream of retailers to Nintendo's summer 1985 CES booth to see the NES, they were still unwilling to sign up to distribute the console. So I had a Rob system. I used it for about 2 or 3 months, but I got tired of replacing the batteries because the spinning gyros, to spin it, it required 1 D-cell battery. And the Rob itself required, I want to say C's, but it could have been double A's, but it was a whole bunch of them. So every time I wanted to use it, I had to replace all the batteries in it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So he basically sat on a shelf because he was cool looking. But honestly, the Rob was a gimmick. You didn't realize it at the time because he looked like he was part of the system because you could play that Gyromite game. But when we went in to go, okay, I have to borrow the pod back machine for a second. Me and the old man, it's about 1980, late 85, early 86. Me and the old man are going into, I want to say Target, to go buy some controllers for our Atari because we've worn our controllers out. We couldn't fix them anymore. So we go in and we start looking for controllers. And then he looks up and he's like, is that a robot? And I'm like, yeah, that's that new system, that Nintendo Entertainment System. He's like, well, okay. Because, the cartridge, the paddles for the Atari were cheap, the Atari branded ones, but there were some off brand ones, that were more expensive. They didn't have the Atari branded paddles at the time. They only had the more expensive ones. So I'm looking at those and he's looking up that thing. He's like, for $50 more, I can buy that whole thing. Is it faster? I'm like, yeah, it's the next generation or whatever. And he's like, why don't we just get that? So we bought that and came home, and me and Ma and the old man proceeded to play Duck Hunt for the next 6 hours.
Oh, wow.
It was in the summer. So yeah, we brought it home, I'd say about 5, 6 o'clock when we were going to play the Atari. And we plugged it up into, I want to say in a TV in Mom's room because my Atari was hooked up to my room. And he didn't want to jack with the old console we had in the living room. So we hooked it up at a TV in Mom's room. And we just started playing Duck Hunt. And again, we played it for 6 hours. And laughing at the dog. He's like, okay. And so the next day I busted out the robot and played the Gyromite game, which was fun. But after that, we got a few more games and we were up and running. I mean, I want to say I played Super Mario Brothers every day when I was in junior high and high school, at least for, 30 minutes or so. Just playing it. And that the Nintendo, unlike the Atari, the paddles never broke down. When I finally got rid of that thing, it was still fully functioning. I mean, the pins were a little loose. Sometimes you had to jack the cartridge down just right. You had one, you know what I'm talking about.
Right.
Blow on the cartridge, you have to put it in.
Yep.
Set it down. Just to get it to set right because of that pin connector they had. So Nintendo decided to he went to New York at I want to say it was FAO Schwartz, but it may have been someplace else. He hired a bunch of telemarketers on the Christmas season of 1985 and brought the full Rob set. He didn't have it because you could buy it with a Rob or without. Eventually they stopped selling it with the Rob after about a year or so. That's why we got it so cheap. But he put up a 15-foot square area in FAO Schwartz with these screens, and it was the biggest thing FAO Schwartz had seen in 50 years. Kids went nuts for it. And by that show, FAO Schwartz had ordered a bunch. Some other toy company executives came in and saw what was going on. They started ordering the Nintendo to sell it as well. Nintendo's unprecedented offer to risk absorption. So Nintendo told them that whatever they don't sell, Nintendo would buy back from them. And so the toy makers started signing up and they're like, hey, it's your funeral. So when they initially launched, because they had run tests on all of those games on that Versus system, and they'd done the test at FAO Schwartz, they had 17 games at the opening. They had Gyromite and Duck Hunt if you bought the advanced system, with the Rob and everything. If you bought the smaller system, you still got the gun and you got Duck Hunt. But they also had 10-Yard Flight, baseball, Clue Ladder, Excite Bike, golf, Hogan's Alley, Ice Climber, Kung Fu, Pinball, Soccer, Stack Up, Super Mario Brothers, Tennis Wild Gunman, and Wrecking Crew. This was with their official launch on October 18th, 1985 in New York City. They headquartered in Hackensack Warehouse, when they said was oozing with EPA hazards, something like rats and snakes and toxic waste. They eventually moved up to a better facility in New York, but they wanted to start as cheap as they could. Howard Phillips called every waking hour at the crack of dawn, 7 days a week. President Arakawa joined them at that warehouse and at retail stores, once running a TV up a flight of stairs just to follow the whole team's footsteps. While unloading their products into stores, the Nintendo America crew was confronted by strangers who resented any Japanese-influenced company in a time of international trade issues with cheap Japanese clones of American products. A security guard reportedly said, "You're working for the Japs? I hope you fall flat of your ass."
Ouch.
I know. It's like, what? Dude, come on. So there's a bunch of animosity. But by early 1986, because remember, this is October, by early 1986, Nintendo said it had sold nearly 90,000 units in 9 weeks. And 460,000 game cartridges were sold in 1985. So from October of 1985 to December of 1985, they sold 460,000 cartridges.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. They hadn't even got started yet. In January of 86, an independent research firm commissioned by Nintendo delivered a survey of 200 NES owners, showing that the most popular given reason for buying an NES was because children wanted to rob the robot, followed most strongly by good graphics, variety of games, and the uniqueness and newness of the NES package. Rob is credited as primary factor in building initial support for the NES in North America. But the accessory itself was not well received for its entertainment value. The original Famicom counterpart, the Famicom robot, was already failing in Japan at the time of the North American launch. The NES was also credited with bringing arcade-style gaming to home. Further information on Rob's key role in the NES launch, Rob, I've got some more information on there. I've included some videos in our stuff. But again, Rob was a toy. He was just designed to get people's eyes on the system. They stopped selling Rob after the first, I think, production run. Because by the late 1986, when you bought an NES, you didn't buy it with the Rob. You bought it with the light gun, and you had a Super Mario / Duck Hunt cartridge. And that's what everybody bought it with. That's what it came standard with. Because Super Mario Brothers was the game that everybody wanted to play. Which again came from that Famicom disk system. So like I said, it's about this time they start really, really winding up. So what did you think about the NES? Since we've been talking about this for a while, I haven't even asked. What did you think about the NES system?
Oh, I had fun with it. It was a good system. It was a really good system. It was easily better than the Atari 2600, which I had. Mm-hmm. So I mean, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, it was better than the Coleco system because they basically bet the farm on the Atom, and the Atom didn't work right.
Right.
And a television had that trouble with them trying to come out with a computer that didn't really work right. And of course, all of Atari's troubles. NES was a breath of fresh air. It just ran. Now, we didn't get that first Sega console over here. We did eventually get a Sega console over here in late 1986, early 1987. But Nintendo had already saturated the market. In fact, we talked about it. We talked about the Sega Master System. This was its competitor, and it blew its doors off. Not just here. The NES also launched in Europe, in Australia, and Oceania, and it did really, really well. The only place where Nintendo didn't really capture the market was in England. England was more either home computers or they liked the Sega the Sega Master System. Nintendo still sold a crap ton of consoles there, but that wasn't their thing. The English were way more into the Sega and way more into the basically Commodore 64s, because that's what they wanted to play games on, which I understand. I mean, even at the time, the graphics were a little bit better. And the Sega Master System was a fairly superior product to the NES because it was released later. Because remember, the Sega released the SG-1000, and then they released the SG-1002, and then they upgraded it again and released the SG-1003, which is the Sega Master System. So it was a couple of years ahead of Nintendo when it got released over here. Because, what we got in the NES was a redesigned Famicom that was capable of handling some of the disk system games on cartridges instead of discs. But that's all it was. It was beefed up a little bit, but it wasn't beefed up nearly as much as that SG-1000 Mark III or Sega Master System. There are a lot of videos and collectors and stuff out there on this stuff, especially on YouTube and things like that, where they talk about and get into the nuts and bolts of this. And I'm sorry, some of this stuff was a little dry, but I had a lot of facts and figures I had to go to. I had to go through a lot of Japanese names, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
But it sold well in Oceania and Asia. It sold well in the Soviet Union, believe it or not. They made the Dendy, which was a Famiclone console, in the Soviet Union. It wasn't a copy of the NES because that was entirely too much of the Western devil, as it were. But they did copy the Famicom, and it sold fairly well over there. But most of the games themselves are bootlegs. They did sell 6 million units of the Dendy in Russia and the former Soviet Union at the time, and they sold that Dendy up until like the late 90s. So, and again, Nintendo led the industry. The Famicom had sold about 6.2 million units by 1986, and increased their sales to more than 9 million units. That's just in Japan. And they had 95% of the home video game market in Japan. And they had more competitors. In North America, the NES sold 1.1 million units in 1986 out of a worldwide sales of 3 million that year. By 1988, the console had sold 12 million units in Japan and was projected to top 10 million units in the United States by the end of the year. The NES widely outsold its primary competitors, the Sega Master System and the Atari 7800. The successful launch of the NES positioned Nintendo to dominate the home video game market for the remainder of the 80s. That's a fair assessment.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that's correct. Beyond the success of the system, the NES Game Pack produced similar sales records. The console's library exploded with classic flagship franchises, building the best software hits like Super Mario Brothers, The Legend of Zelda, Metroid. NES had dwarfed the sales of Teddy Ruxpin, which was the best-selling toy of that year when they released the NES. And other products by the American distributor Worlds of Wonder. And in October of 1987, Nintendo America President Minoru Arakawa discontinued the NES distribution contract with failing Worlds of Wonder in favor of Nintendo's own growing clout. While hiring World of Wonder sales staff away, the same sales staff previously offered to Nintendo by the Atari in 1983. So they ended up getting the salespeople that they originally wanted to get in 83 anyway. Legend of Zelda, which was released in 87, was the first NES game to sell over 1 million cartridges. At more than 40 million copies, Super Mario Brothers was the highest selling video game in history for many years. The thing was, when you bought Super Mario Brothers, or when you bought the NES, it came with Super Mario Brothers after about 1986. By 1987, everyone you bought had Super Mario Brothers in it. So you can't really get accurate sales numbers but they want to say there were 40 million copies sold because they sold with each one of the consoles. By mid-'86, 19% of Japanese households owned a Famicom. And by 1990, over 27 million units were sold in the United States, which was 38% of all U.S. households. So, yeah, about 40% of us had them. And Trip Hawkins called Nintendo the last hurrah of the 8-bit world, with Nintendo having completely destroyed the Commodore 64 game market by Christmas of 1988. And in the late 80s, Nintendo's dominance was addressed by newer, technologically superior consoles. In 1987, NEC and Hudson Soft released the PC Engine, and in 1988, Sega released the 16-bit Mega Drive. They kind of took over Nintendo's sales for a while until the Japanese released the Super Famicom over there and the Super Famicom, or the Super Nintendo over here, which is a story for a different time. That's about it for Nintendo. I mean, I could go on and on about numbers and things like that. Some of these games were just incredible to play. One of my favorites being Kung Fu. I could sit down and play Kung Fu right now and beat it and be happy. It takes me about a half an hour. I got to where I was really good at it because I played it all the time. I actually preferred Kung Fu to Super Mario Brothers, and people think I'm crazy, but I just like playing it. It had bosses and stuff in it, so
right.
I mean, that was, Well, of course, I guess Super Mario Brothers did too, but they were really easy to beat. So. But yeah, that's about it for the NES. Thank you so much. I do want to mention out they do have the Super NES Classic Edition out there. So if you want to get out and play some of these games, including Kung Fu and Super Mario Brothers, you could buy this tiny little console, this just little bitty thing, which is a quarter of the size of the NES. With full-size controllers, and plug it into your HD television and go to town on it. It's a lot of fun. They were hard to come by, but they've sold 3.6 million units of those already. But yeah, that's about it for Nintendo, other than get out there and play it.
Cool. Thanks for another trip down a video game console. Done many of these before. Appreciate another story of one.
Yeah, some people like to nerd out about this stuff, especially like the history of it. And I think it's fascinating that Atari could have cornered the market and they just decided to throw a fit instead.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, with that, I guess I will take over on the murdery side of the house.
Murder.
Today I got my information off All That's Interesting, Wikipedia, the Albuquerque Journal, and KRQE News, and this is the story of the West Mesa Murders.
West Mesa Murders.
Yes. At least 11 women were killed and then buried in the desert during the West Mesa Murders that took place in Albuquerque, New Mexico between 2001 and 2005. Several suspects have been named, but none were arrested or charged. While the killings were initially believed to be the work of a serial killer, the involvement of a sex trafficking ring has been suspected. An anonymous tip to authorities at 8PB and the FBI linked the murders to a suspect from Central America. Police have also suspected the involvement of a sex trafficking ring operating through neighboring Texas that targeted sex workers during events throughout the Southwest, Southern, and Western United States, especially regularly scheduled events such as New Mexico State Fair in this case to take advantage of reliably heavier traffic. This small fragment of human trafficking ring involves numerous population centers, including Las Vegas and Nevada, El Paso and Killeen in Texas, and Denver and Colorado. At first, it was like any other Monday night, but February 2nd, 2009 would stick with Christine Ross forever. Ross walked her dog Ruka along a dried-out wash in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then Ruka found a bone resembling a femur. Ross would soon discover that 11 dead bodies, now known as the West Mesa Murders, lay beneath. It was the most disturbing murder case the Albuquerque police had ever seen, and it remains unsolved to this day. At first, the pace was frantic. There were human remains to identify and a serial killer to catch. It took nearly a year for medical examiners to identify the decomposing victims, most of whom were Hispanic and all of whom were female. Reported missing between 2001 and 2005, they ranged in age from 15 to 32.
Holy crap.
The fact that all but one of the victims had links to sex work initially helped guide the police investigation for the serial killer they dubbed the West Mesa Bone Collector. But not even FBI profilers were able to find the killer, and to this day only theories remained, but police say they continue to follow up on leads to this day. Promising leads became dead ends with every cleared suspect. Detectives were left with the fact that the serial killers move with ease, often vanishing long before their victims are ever found. Perhaps precisely because of this, the FBI's $100,000 reward for information has gone uncollected for over a decade. Ross wasn't sure the bone was human, but knew it could be. She took a picture and messaged her sister, a registered nurse, who confirmed that it was. And with her call to the Albuquerque Police Department, Ross began to expose horrors that the city had never seen. Combing the undeveloped West Mesa near 118th Street Southwest, detectives spent weeks uncovering all 11 graves. They had to unearth skeleton after skeleton from a mass burial site in a 100-acre barren patch of desert on Albuquerque's far southwest Mesa. And they had to do so with the utmost care. Any piece of evidence uncovered with the bones could lead them to the killer.
Oh my God, I bet that was hot.
Oh, yeah. The crime scene, which police called one of the largest in American history, required teams of investigators working around the clock to coordinate the dig. The graves held the remains of 2 teens and 9 adults, one of whom, 22-year-old Gina Michelle Valdez, was 4 months pregnant when she died. The only emerging pattern was that 10 of the victims were sex workers or victims of sex trafficking. The 11th, meanwhile, was 15-year-old Jamie Barella. She was found buried next to her 27-year-old cousin, Evelyn Salazar. Both had disappeared after walking to a local park in 2004. All but one of the victims of the West Mesa murders were born and raised in New Mexico and were Hispanic. 15-year-old Selenia Edwards was identified as the only black victim at the site, as well as the only one from out of state. Edwards was classified as an endangered runaway from Lawton, Oklahoma in 2003, and was last seen with 3 sex workers in Aurora, Colorado in May 2004. According to police reports, she may have gone by Mimi or Chocolate while staying at the Ranger Motel. Police did promise the families of the victims that justice would be done. All they ever found, however, were bones and DNA of 11 people. In addition to Barella, Edwards, and Salazar and Valdez, they are Monica Candelaria, 22, Victoria Chavez, 26, Virginia Cloven, 24, Cinnamon Elks, 32, Doreen Marquez, 24, Julie Nieto, 24, and Veronica Romero, 28. There hasn't been the degree of public fear and alarm that you might expect. There's been very little publicity, and there's a sense of physical remoteness. This place is very removed, said University of New Mexico professor Dirk Gibson, who's written 2 books on serial killers. He also said there has been little pressure on the police to investigate. While the FBI created suspect profiles, Albuquerque police knocked on doors. They gather information from grieving families and locals, which helped clear up when the victims were last seen, but not how they died. Barella was last seen at a family gathering, which she and Salazar left for a park on San Mateo and Gibson Boulevard near the airport, but most of the other victims had vanished with even fewer details. Many had gone into sex work or had run away from home years before they died. The police were at a loss. The tragic truth was that sex workers made for easy targets and are often distanced from relatives while communities are blind to their disappearance. Most of them hadn't even been reported missing at the time their remains were found. Christine Barber said that's why the Mesa killer was able to do it. She's the head of Safe Streets in New Mexico, a nonprofit that helps get women off the streets. And she said no one even noticed that they were gone. A chilling lead came from satellite photos of the West Mesa burial site. A 2004 image showed a set of tire tracks leading directly from the area. But by 2009, when the bones were discovered, development had erased any hopes of automobile evidence. By 2016, only one detective remained full-time on the case, Mark Maroney. He has interviewed 200 local women with similar backgrounds and created timelines for every suspect. He said, quote, many of the persons of interest have been eliminated by means of that timeline. Police suspect that the bodies were all buried by the same person or persons, and may be the work of a serial killer who has since come to be referred to again as the West Mesa Bone Collector. Over time, a number of men have attracted police attention, though not named as full suspects and connected with the murders. Fred Reynolds was a pimp who knew one of the missing women, excuse me, and reportedly had photos of missing sex workers, and he died of natural causes in January of 2009. In August 2010, police searched several properties in Joplin, Missouri, associated with local photographer and businessman Ron Irwin in connection with the West Mesa cases. They confiscated tens of thousands of photos from the man who reportedly used to visit the state fair in Albuquerque, but then police confirmed they had cleared Irwin as a suspect. In December 2010, convicted Colorado serial killer Scott Lee Kimball stated that he was being investigated for the West Mesa murder, but he denied killing the women. Today, 2 suspects remain, only of whom one is still alive. Joseph Blay was in prison when the bodies were found, but he became a suspect when his ex-wife contacted police. Blay had been dubbed the mid-school rapist for his activities in the 1980s. Police say he would often break into the homes of 13 to 15-year-old girls who lived near McKinley Middle School in Albuquerque and rape them. In one case, there was a DNA sample, but the rape test kit was not retested until 2010, eventually linking Blee to the rape. Her daughter had found women's clothing and jewelry in their home, with some families later revealing that the victim's jewelry was missing. Furthermore, police encountered Blay nearly 140 times between 1990 and 2009, often in drug-heavy areas that the victims were known to frequent. They also found electrical tape and rope in his car when he was arrested in 2003 for exposing himself to a woman. Police also saw him stalking sex workers after the West Mesa murders. In 2015, Blee was also suspected by police of killing a sex worker. His DNA sample was located on the inner waistband and belt of a sex worker found dead on Central Avenue, a notorious street for sex work in the eastern part of the city. In addition, a tree tag from a nursery was found in the area where the West Mesa victims' bodies were buried, and it was tracked to a nursery Blee once frequented. His cellmate said Blee admitted to knowing many of the murdered women, had even hit one of them for allegedly trying to steal his money. But ultimately, a lack of evidence failed to pin the murders on Blee, who is serving a 90-year sentence for sexual assault from the 1980s to 1990. With a similar history as Blee, Lorenzo Montoya was known to pick up prostitutes and assault them. He even beat his girlfriend, who said he threatened to kill me and bury me in lime. Coworkers said he had talked about killing women and burying them on the West Mesa. And in 2006, Montoya met up with a dancer whom he strangled to death. When her boyfriend arrived, he shot and killed Montoya. Ominously, Montoya was holding a flashlight when he died while his victim was wrapped in a blanket near his SUV. And in 2006, there were reportedly dirt trails leading from his trailer park to the site. But although Montoya fit the description, the West Mesa serial killer still remains unidentified. Dirk Gibson has no faith that will change because police lack the necessary incentive. He said, quote, Albuquerqueans don't relate to the victims. They think they're just a bunch of hookers and drug addicts. Police budgets are stretched thin. There's so little money and there are so many crimes. Investigating a 10-year-old crime where police think that the victim had it coming, there's just no incentive for that.
Wow, that's dark.
Mm-hmm. On the 13th anniversary of the discovery of the first remains tied to the West Mesa murders, police investigators and other city officials made a plea to the public for new information that could help solve the case. Alongside case specialists and FBI officials, the Albuquerque police chief and mayor held a news conference about the notorious cold case. Albuquerque Mayor Tim Keller said, quote, "The only way this case is going to get solved is with our community's help or even communities around us that might know something. We need new information on this case, and that is what is going to lead to getting it solved." Albuquerque Crime Stoppers continues to offer a reward of up to $100,000 for information related to the case. If you have any information about the case, call 505-768-2450 or Crime Stopper at 505-843-STOP. And you can also contact the Albuquerque PD investigator Ida Lopez at ilopez@cabq.gov.
If you see something, say something.
Oh, and that is the story of the West Mesa murders.
Wow. Well, thank you, sir. I'm really surprised that happened between 2001. Well, it was discovered in 2009.
Mm-hmm.
I'm surprised I'd never heard of that.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah, pretty interesting case, and unfortunately it remains unsolved.
Well, thank you for taking us on that trip, sir.
Thank you for taking it with me. That'll take us to the end of another recording week. As always, you can find our information on nerderyandmurdery.com, where you can find pictures and links to everything we talked about today, as well as information about our YouTube channel.
That's right. We do have a YouTube channel where we make a playlist for every single nerdery on every single episode. So you can go back and look and see what we're talking about, give you some examples of things that you might have missed, or in this case, commercials for the NES, right, as well as some specs and things, videos of that nature.
Awesome. Thank you for all your work on that.
Thank you, sir.
You can also find the link to our merchandise, for if you wish to show off your Nerdery and Murdery fandom, please do consider going to the store and seeing what you can get there. And you can also find the link to our Patreon, where if you wish to become a donator to the show, there are costs associated with keeping the show going. You can become a patron and donate to the show and help us out with that. We do appreciate each and every one of you.
Please and thank you.
Please and thank you. And last but not least, please don't forget to leave a 5-star review wherever you can. It helps us and helps others find our content that may be looking for us. So with that,
I have been Zig with your Nerdery.
And I'm Geoffrey with your Murdery.
Cue the music.